everyone. This is Larry Anderson. Thank you for letting me be part of your study again. I appreciate it. I'll be with you twice coming up. Today we're looking at Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 35. And then after that, we'll look at Daniel 11, verses 36 to 45. It's a big chapter, and it's got a lot of complicated expansion of other revelations, other visions, prophecies of events near history's end, and also at the time in the current life of Israel. So there's a lot here. It's interpreted literally rather than allegorically, and the passage begins with a description of the Persian Empire to the death of Alexander the Great, whose empire at that point was divided between four of its generals. So the scene that we have is Alexander the Great and his pursuit of power and his march. But we also have the Roman Empire that's emerging on the world scene. We still have Syria, we have Babylon, we have other former powers that are still vying for place in this region. And so there's lots of wars, there's lots of transition. If you think that politics are complicated today, you should have lived back then, because it was, to be the king was hazardous to your health. And a lot of these kings, a lot of the leaders of these countries didn't last very long, and it was fraught with trouble and terror and war and division and all of those things. So we'll look a little bit at all of this and see what we come up with. But the first part that we're going to look at is Daniel looking at the past, looking at here's where Israel is going, here's what's going to happen on the world stage. So that's the past. Then the second half of this chapter is really projecting into the future and what God is going to do, including 7 years, first half, second half, mentions of, or allusions to the Antichrist, those kinds of things will all be part of this. And so it's complicated, it's crazy. It's why a lot of people don't spend a lot of time in chapters like this, because it's really hard to get a handle on it. Let me share with you a couple things. There were wars in the four generals that took over after Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. There were four generals. The Ptolemies came out of Egypt. They were in Egypt in the south of the kingdom. The Seleucids of Babylon and Syria were in the north. And in the time, the Seleucids dominate Palestine, and one of them, Antiochus Epiphanes, institutes a great persecution of the Jews that we'll see in verses 21 to 25. Many of Antiochus's characteristics serve as a type of the Antichrist, his latter-day counterpart, who is then introduced in verses 36 to 39. Though the Antichrist initially succeeds, he soon falls in verses 40 and 45. And although the Jews experience a great tribulation before this defeat, at the time, the dead will be raised and judged, and the prophecy is sealed to indicate the official and binding statement of God's intent. So what we have here is talking about struggles with Israel, talking about the wars. Israel's sort of a little country wedged in between all of these warring nations, and they get run over on a regular basis. But what Daniel is seeing is, yes, people are going to stray from God, and yes, there's going to be tribulation and trouble, but in the end, God's promises are still going to be fulfilled, and God's going to do his work in the world. The passage previous visions of Daniel indicated a dark future for Israel, and he was anxious for a further word from the Lord. The Old Testament abounds with truth that God reveals himself only when men are willing to pay the price in spiritual discipline. And so Daniel's mourning and fasting was related to his intense desire to know more concerning the historical situation and Israel's relation to it. I do want to point out at this point also that the historic revelations in this chapter are remarkable in their accuracy. And it really is a historic textbook of what happened during this time. So you get this great accuracy in the beginning of the chapter that's been fulfilled. And then you look at the future, and it gives us great confidence that what was true and what happened there, God will continue to fulfill his word and fulfill his promises to his people. So the Old Testament gives us a lot of truth that God reveals himself to us in spiritual discipline. Daniel is asking the Lord for it. Daniel, like Ezekiel, groveled in the dust when he was overpowered by God's presence. In the Old Testament, ecstatic experience is almost always followed by complete immobility, and that's what Daniel experienced. God is not willing, however, for his servants to remain in this position. He respects their dignity and wishes them to rise and stand erect. And so we get all of these incredible pictures of how God is working, of God's greatness, all of this. And so let's look at some more of the history here. Scholars are fairly well agreed that chapter 11, verses 1 to 35, give a selective account of history from Persia down to some place in the latter part of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Many details are given concerning war and the family life of the Greek period, especially during the reigns of Antiochus the Great, and that was between 222 to 187 BC, and Antiochus Epiphanes between 175 and 164 BC. Although Antiochus the Great inflicted the Jews, it was Epiphanes who was the mad monster and defiled everything that the Jews held sacred. And so he holds a special place in this Jewish history. The first 20 verses of chapter 11 form a preamble to the madman's reign. The intricate details concerning the family of both the Seleucid rulers in the north and the Ptolemies who reigned in Egypt have convinced many scholars that this section was written by a man on the scene rather than predicted by Daniel in Babylonian exile. But we know that many of the prophecies are so accurate that perhaps they were confirmed by someone on the scene, but we know God spoke to Daniel, and we, his credibility remains firm. Verses 20 to 35 in chapter 11 are universally accepted as outlining the wild career of Epiphanes. A certain vagueness is present, however, beginning in verse 36. Scholarship divides at this point. Those who believe that this book was written during the Maccabee period as a contemporary history contend the author knew Epiphanes and would come to an end, but it was not exactly certain to the nature of it. It's a historical fact that Epiphanes died very suddenly and under strange conditions, perhaps mental illness being part of the causes. And generally, history scholars think that he died insane after being called the madman. After all the persecution of the Jews, he died insane. And so those who have a futuristic school of thought contend verses 36 to 35 leap over the centuries and give us a picture of the final battle in connection with the second coming of Christ. And so we get this perspective, we get this sudden leap to the future. It's basically the same group who believes this as who interpret chapters 2 and 7 as giving the fourth kingdom a picture of the restored Roman Empire in Europe at the consummation of history. They, of course, interpret the first few verses of chapter 12 as the period of tribulation immediately preceding the grand and glorious appearing of Christ. So we get this complicated, comprehensive look at what happened in history and what is going to happen in the future. Now, back to the passage, the previous visions of Daniel indicated a dark future for Israel. And so we get this picture that he was looking to God to give him a vision for how God was going to solve this, that what was God going to do. And so we know that Daniel had great confidence and great faith in the Lord. And we know that from even as you've studied the first 10 chapters in Daniel, you can see his faithfulness to God, and you can see how God used him in history with the Romans. So let's look at a few more verses. Chapter 11, verse 29 talks about Antiochus moved against Egypt in the south. Now, the Ptolemies in the north, the Egyptians in the south were constantly at war with each other, constantly bringing armies against each other. Antiochus opposed by the Romans who'd come to Egypt in ships in the western coastlands. As he was going to war, the Roman senator Populus Laenas took to Antiochus a letter forbidding him to engage in war with Egypt. Antiochus then asked for time to consider. The emissary drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and asked for, and said, demanded that he give his answer before he stepped out of the circle. So have this picture. Antiochus he's going to attack Egypt. The senator from Rome comes and says, don't do it. And when he asks for time to consider that, he draws a circle around him and he demands, give me an answer before you step out of the circle. So, and Antiochus is, he's humiliated by what's happened, but he has no alternative but to return to his own land. And so Antiochus took out his frustration at that point on the Jews, the city of Jerusalem and the temple. He vented his fury against the Holy Covenant, the entire Mosaic system, favoring any renegade Jews who turned to him for help. He encouraged Jews to forsake their historic religion, to forsake God, and to join him in his pagan rituals and to follow him. And then he lavished praise and gifts on those who were willing to join him. He desecrated the temple. He abolished daily sacrifice. He sent his general Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers into Jerusalem on what was purported to be a peace mission, but they attacked Jerusalem on the Sabbath and killed many people, took many women and children as slaves, and plundered and burned the city. In seeking to exterminate Judaism and to Hellenize the Jews, turn those Jews into Greek-speaking Jews, he forbade the Jews to follow their religious practices, including their festivals and circumcision, and commanded that copies of the law be burned. And then he set up the abomination that causes desolation. In culminating act, he directed in December of 167 BC, an altar to Zeus on the altar of burnt offerings outside the temple, and had a pig offered to Zeus on that altar. The Jews were compelled to offer a pig on the 25th of each month to celebrate Antiochus and Epiphanes' birthday. Antiochus, sorry, I'm saying this name different at different times, but Antiochus is how you pronounce it. Antiochus promised apostate Jews, those who violated the covenant, great reward if they would set aside the God of Israel and worship Zeus, the god of Greece. Many in Israel were persuaded by his promises and his flattery and worshiped the false god. However, a small remnant remained faithful to God, refusing to engage in those abominable practices. Antiochus IV died insane in Persia in 163 BC, but the Jews still suffered. The Jews who refused to submit to Antiochus, his false religious system, were persecuted and martyred for their faith. The word fall literally means to stumble, and it refers to severe suffering on the part of many and the death of many others. And this caused the new rise of the Maccabean revolt. Mattathias, a priest, was the father of 5 sons. One of them, Judas, became well known for refurbishing and restoring the temple in late 164 BC. He was called Judas Maccabeus, the Hammerer. In 166, Mattathias refused to submit to the false religious system. He and his son fled from Jerusalem to the mountains and lived there. A very small group, joined them after a while, but the group grew. As their movement became popular, many joined them, some out of sincere motives, others out of false motives. The suffering that the faithful endured served to refine and purify them. And this time of persecution, it was short in duration, but painful. It had previously been revealed to Daniel that the temple would be desecrated. And for 1,150 days, it would be that way. Here, Daniel is assured that this persecution would run its course and be lifted, for the end will come in God's appointed time. And he had that promise. So we have this fascinating piece of history. We have this time of war, of political intrigue, we have Alexander the Great. We've got the Roman Empire coming up. We've got Antiochus and other leaders trying to desecrate Judaism, get people to leave. We have all of this going on, and yet God has made a promise to his people. And as we'll see next time, God always keeps his promises.